Welcome to day 3 of annual meeting and our first day of the Quaker Public Policy Institute. We're starting today with our presentation of the Justice Award. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Carrie Colfer, FCNL's lobbyist for Native American policy. Carrie? All right, it looks like Carrie is frozen there, and hopefully we can get her back on in just a moment. But for right now, I am going to turn it over to Diane Randall. Diane, you ready?
Work in peace and nuclear disarmament with the Ed Snyder Award. Beginning this year, FCNL has established a new Justice Award honoring a member of Congress who has advanced policy to create a more just society and country, unapologetically recognizing the dignity of all people, demonstrated major leadership in one of FCNL's priority issue areas, advanced the rights and opportunities of the most vulnerable, and promoted racial justice in U.S. policy. And it is indeed a great honor for us to have Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico with us. It is so fitting that she is the first recipient of FCNL's Justice Award. And I am incredibly honored to recognize her. We are very grateful for all of her incredible work, and we look forward to continuing to support her in these efforts in the 117th Congress. Representative Haaland has worked closely with FCNL's congressional advocate for Native American issues, Carrie Colfer, and I'm hoping Carrie's screen is working again and she can come back on and make just a couple remarks before we turn it over to Congresswoman Haaland. Oh, I'm so sad. I just want to say Carrie has done remarkable work for FCNL on the Violence Against Women Act and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in fact, I want to read what we are writing on this award for Representative Deb Haaland. We commend Representative Haaland for her leadership in the fight to end the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is evident in her Not Invisible Act. We are profoundly grateful for Congresswoman Haaland's commitment to providing much needed resources to Native communities in the Violence Against Women Act and to ensuring the voices of Native survivors are heard. Thank all of you for joining me and the more than 600 other people from 45 states, including New Mexico, who are gathered here today as we prepare to lobby for the Justice and Policing Act tomorrow. And now I would like to invite the Congresswoman to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here. Happy Native American Heritage Month. And thank you for having me here at the 77th annual meeting of the Friends Committee on National Legislation to accept the Justice Award for National Legislative Leadership in Advancing Social Justice. I'd like to say a big congratulations to Senator Gillibrand, who will be on tomorrow for receiving the Snyder Peace Award for helping to bring an end to almost 2 decades of war and reducing the suffering of those impacted by violent conflict. The violence that we're both working to reduce inside and outside of the United States is fundamental to begin healing, especially at a time when we need it most. It's an honor to be recognized for the work that I was able to accomplish during the 116th Congress to help find solutions to stop the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. Even before I was elected to Congress, I've been committed to making sure that fundamental resources are provided to tribal communities so that Indigenous survivors are heard and to raise national awareness on the issue and bring this awful crisis to an end. Before discussing some of the federal legislation that I have led to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, I first want to note that the disproportionate rates of physical and sexual violence that Indigenous women face isn't unique to the United States, but has also spread to our Indigenous people in Canada, Honduras, and South America. Additionally, I'd like to note that the crisis isn't isolated only to Native women, but to also encompass Indigenous Two-Spirit people and trans women. For example, at least 97 transgender people have been murdered in Honduras since 2009, and 5 transgender women were killed within a 5-month period in Guatemala in 2017. Here in the United States, at least 3 transgender Navajo Nation tribal members have been murdered in my congressional district in Albuquerque, New Mexico, within the last 10 years. While this number doesn't initially sound alarming, please keep in mind that the Navajo Nation is only one of the 23 tribal nations in New Mexico. And most importantly, the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous transgender people is likely much higher. This is because law enforcement at both the state and federal levels don't track victims' tribal affiliation. So accurate data doesn't exist, but we know that these murders are happening. Transgender women and other LGBTQ women are often missing from these discussions, which is something that we all need to raise awareness of as we move forward to resolve the MMIW crisis. To fully comprehend the scope of this issue, the historical context is critical to understand. Native American people in this country come from communities that historically faced genocide, forced removal, and loss of resources that date back to the arrival of the Europeans in the late 1400s. This resulted in centuries of racism and historical genocide against Indigenous people, which of course included severe physical and sexual violence against Native women who continue to be sexualized or overlooked in the media today. It's been a little over 500 years since this crisis began, and we have seen the horrific narrative normalized in American culture through romanticized depictions of Indigenous women and their roles in American history, like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, who were both repeatedly raped and impregnated by the colonizers as teenagers. However, their true stories were often removed from history, the history books that our children read in school. The evidence of this crisis and false romanticization of Native women is even hanging in plain view at the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., which ironically is the epicenter of our democracy. If you go to the Rotunda in the Capitol today, you'll find life-sized oil paintings that depict the so-called beginning of this country that illustrates the ethnic cleansing and conquest of Native Americans. That includes depictions of colonizers baptizing Pocahontas in a Christian church, and fearful, unclothed Native women running from the Europeans when they arrive on this continent. On the same wall in the Rotunda, you will also find a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document that says all men are created equal. However, only 30 lines below that, the founding fathers refer to Native Americans as, quote, merciless Indian savages, unquote. This painting was installed in 1826, which was 194 years ago. This shows just how long the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis has gone unnoticed and even normalized in American culture. The importance of the symbolism of this artwork is even more significant because only 2 years after these paintings were installed, Andrew Jackson was elected as president. During his presidency, Andrew Jackson was successful in carrying out Thomas Jefferson's blueprint of cultural genocide of Indigenous people across this country. Andrew Jackson, whom Trump also has an oil painting of hanging in the Oval Office right now, is credited with carrying out the Indian removal policy that led to the militarization of the Trail of Tears, one of the Native American genocides where our ancestors were marched over 1,000 miles to be imprisoned in military camps, where again, many of the women and children were also raped, murdered, and forgotten in the story of America. To put all this history into perspective, it's been 243 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed, 230 years since the first United States Congress met, and 194 years since these paintings in the Rotunda were hung. However, it's only been 23 months since my sister, Kansas Representative Sharice Davids, and I were elected as the first 2 Native American women to serve in the United States Congress. It's taken Native women over 240 years to finally hold a congressional seat in the United States government, where we can finally advocate for the MMIW crisis, so it doesn't continue to be silent any longer. However, in our tribal communities, this crisis has never been silent. It's been passed down through generational trauma for many failed federal policies and severe underfunding for basic public safety services on Indian reservations and in Indian communities. Yet little has been done at the state or federal level to combat the issue. Whether or not you belong to a tribe, you likely know that Native American women are disproportionately affected by violence compared to any other demographic in the country. This is why I've worked so hard to shed light on these issues and introduce legislation this Congress to bring healing to our communities. Among the most crucial pieces of legislation that I have brought forward is the Not Invisible Act, the first bill introduced by 4 federally recognized tribal members, including Representative Davids, who's a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, myself from Laguna Pueblo. This bill works to establish an advisory committee comprised of law enforcement, tribal leaders, survivors, and their families to address this harrowing epidemic, to find jurisdictional solutions to the complex legal framework of tribal nations. Additionally, I helped introduce an updated version of Savannah's Act, which works to address the MMIW cases by increasing coordination and communication between state, federal, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies. And that will improve data collection to track missing Indigenous people. I'm immensely proud to announce that both the Not Invisible Act and Savannah's Act were recently signed into law to begin the long road ahead to bring justice to Indigenous people. I also sponsored 2 amendments in the House-passed version of the Violence Against Women Act to provide resources for Indigenous victims of domestic violence in state courts, and also expand tribal law enforcement's access to state and federal databases. I want to highlight the importance to everyone on the call today that we must continue to push Senate leadership to pass the House version of the Violence Against Women Act, which was sponsored by Senator Feinstein. Both S 2843 and HR 1585 were carefully drafted with bipartisan support to provide essential protections for Native Americans, and further supported by the Congressional Native American Caucus that I co-chair with Representative Tom Cole. These provisions are vital to move forward. Yet, like many bills in the Senate, they lie on Mitch McConnell's desk collecting dust. Additionally, I also introduced the Badges Act to streamline the BIA's tribal officer hiring process and improve federal data sharing for missing and unidentified Indigenous people, and the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act, which received an overwhelming amount of national support that would restore tribal criminal jurisdiction over domestic violence crimes like dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking. So tribes can finally have the authority to prosecute these crimes on tribal lands. Last, before the end of this month, Senator Warren and I will introduce the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act. This bill is over 200 pages and is the legislative answer to address the chronic underfunding in Indian country across all federal agencies that was identified in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report. This legislation is significant because it aims to reaffirm the federal government's trust responsibility to Native nations and specifically addresses the long-standing budgetary shortfalls to bolster funding for public safety on tribal lands. My legislative work is important to me because there is absolutely no reason why Native women and girls should have to fear that no one will act if they are harmed. It will take a profound and unanimous effort to dismantle this destructive cycle and corrosive narratives about Indigenous people in this country, but I am hopeful that we will see change in our lifetime so that we create a better future for our young Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. Thank you so much again for this award. I'm truly honored. I hope that we'll continue working toward a solution on this long-standing issue because everyone, regardless of who you are, deserves to be safe. Thank you again so much. And Diane, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Haaland. Really, what a richly informative narrative you've given us, and a challenge, really a challenge to continue to advocate on these issues, but also to really look at our own history and redress what we can for the wrongs that are described in our nation's capital. I do want to acknowledge also that if friends are interested, the people who are on this call, if you are not currently a subscriber to our Native American Legislative Update, it's one of our digital newsletters that comes out once a month that Carrie Colfer produces. And I want to encourage you to sign up for that so that you can track these issues and advocate with us. So thank you very much. I think Annie's going to give us a couple of announcements, and then I'm going to come back on to introduce Jose.
So first of all, I just really want to thank Representative Haaland for spending this time with us to accept this award. I know that for me, I could not think of a better speaker to tee us up as we prepare to meet with our congressional offices tomorrow. We're now moving into our lobby prep on the Justice and Policing Act. In a few moments, we'll hear again from Diane, FCNL's General Secretary, and also from Jose Was, FCNL's lead lobbyist on justice reform. We encourage you in the YouTube chat to ask questions as we go through these next sections, and later in the segment, we'll be asking some of the questions from the audience. So be sure that you're active in that chat function in YouTube. If you still have unanswered questions, lingering questions at the end of our legislation segment today, after you hear from Jose and Cameron, never fear. We have office hours this evening at 6:30 Eastern Time, where you can get any of those lingering questions answered. After Jose speaks, we're going to segue into strategies for a successful lobby visit. It's quite a mouthful. Right here on the same YouTube stream, so you don't need to go anywhere. Even if you're an experienced lobbyist who has lobbied with FCNL before, please stick around if you plan on lobbying tomorrow. We ask that all constituents attend both strategies for a successful lobby visit as well as the lobby training in your state delegations at 1:40. That's where you'll learn what the plan is, you'll assign roles, and everybody will know what they're saying and when at their visits tomorrow. This is especially critical because we are in this virtual lobbying format. For the next section, and you'll see this on the screen, please pull out your lobby workbook. If you don't have your lobby workbook, the printed version, you can also find it at fcnl.org/QPPI. You can take notes in the workbook. We encourage you to in this next segment, and find the lobby ask there as well. Once again, that also exists online at fcnl.org/QPPI. Now I'm going to turn things back over to Diane Randall.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for all that instruction. There's a big afternoon ahead of us in preparation for our lobbying tomorrow, and I think you're going to find this next keynote by Jose Was deeply inspiring and informative. And I know that the training that Jem Kaysen and Shoshana Abrams is leading is going to be really powerful. So, and as well as you're breaking into smaller groups and working with some of the staff here at FCNL and preparing for your lobby visits. So thanks for joining us. Before I talk a little bit about Jose and about this work, I want to just remind all of you, those of you who've been with us for the last couple of days, and to inform those of you who are just joining us now, that in addition to setting a goal for how many people we could get to come lobby with us on the Justice and Policing Act, we set ourselves a goal for finding new people who would be willing to become sustainers of FCNL. Sustainers are people who give monthly gifts, and this type of giving is so valuable for our ongoing sustainability of FCNL. So if you are interested in being one of the sustainers, we're trying to have 25 new sustainers during this annual meeting. I hope you will consider signing up before tomorrow's end of the day so we can reach our goal. We currently have 11 people who have signed up. So please help us meet that goal if you can. So one of the things that I think is really rich about our work, and if you have done any lobby training with us, you know that we talk consistently about building relationships with members of Congress. Why do we do this? We do it because we believe it is essential for us to exercise our civic responsibility for tracking and caring what happens, as well as for engaging in civil conversation with people who we disagree with, and for encouraging those who we might agree with to take greater leadership. And you're going to find out more about how to do that on this issue of justice and policing. The work that we do here, as we as Quakers often talk about this work as seeing that of God in every person. And sometimes we talk about recognizing the dignity of every person, what Representative Haaland talked about. Clearly, the Justice and Policing Act is aiming to do that through some specific federal changes that Jose will inform you on. What's important to know is that this work is not just about what's happening this week, but this work will need to go on next year as well. It's unlikely that we'll see the Senate act on this legislation before the end of 2020, and this will be part of the advocacy that FCNL does in 2021. Your commitment to talking to your representatives and senators to let them know that you care about this, that they have constituents who expect them to take action, is just incredibly important. And to tell you how relevant and important your lobbying will be, I'm going to now turn this over to Jose Santos-Was, who is our lead lobbyist for justice reform and election integrity. Now, some of you know Jose already because he has worked with FCNL for a number of years now and has been the lead lobbyist for our work on mass incarceration as well. Jose has a heart very much for addressing the challenges of over-incarceration and for what happens to people when they are no longer incarcerated and what opportunities they have. He also has a heart for addressing the over-militarized policing and the devastating ways that we have allowed policing to become unjust. Jose plays a leading role in the interfaith criminal to the Faithful Democracy Coalition. He also spends a lot of time lobbying. He visits many, many congressional offices, meeting with staff, analyzing the politics of these issues, and figuring out how to get policy reform work done. Jose is going to speak for a few minutes, and then he's going to be joined by the program assistant for this program, Cameron Point, for a discussion about specific aspects of the legislation on Tuesday. This information can prepare you as you get ready to go into congressional offices. And remember, if you have questions, please post them in the comments on YouTube. And as Annie said, come to the office hours this afternoon to find out a little bit more. So Jose Was, thank you for your leadership at FCNL and for joining us to remark now.
Implicit bias, racism, and its manifestations in violent policing violates this central truth. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered after 8 minutes and 15 seconds under the knee of Officer Derek Chauvin, as 3 other officers stood by and watched. They did nothing. Nothing. As George Floyd slowly felt his life slipping away, he repeated, "I can't breathe," and cried out for his mother. The other officers just watched on as a man was killed. It's easy to write off George Floyd's murder as an isolated incident. It is harder to take a long, hard look at our policing system in the US as a whole. This was not simply the action of one bad actor. George Floyd's murder is a result of our current policing system that allows officers like Derek Chauvin to harm Black and brown lives without meaningful repercussions. Those who decry violent protesters, in the same breath as they condemn George Floyd's murder, seek to discredit a movement for justice. They also want this to be a case of an isolated incident that affords the system to seem righteous and just. But we are sick and tired of these isolated incidents. These are Black lives being taken from us. This should be above politics. It's life and death. Now imagine sleeping in your bed. Your boyfriend is shocked to hear the door ripped open. He fires his gun in self-defense to protect his home. The people who just broke in start firing indiscriminately, looking for drugs. They make their way to the bedroom, and a still sleeping Breonna Taylor is shot and succumbs to her injuries. She dies. These people are police officers sworn to protect. Instead, they've murdered a young woman at the prime of her life. A public servant herself, she was an emergency medical technician, and a good one at that. Black people are more often seen as criminal, and we have a carceral state around us created by the war on drugs and harsh sentencing policies. These laws create a structure that is institutional racism in our policing. We know that policing is rife with institutional racism. The hashtags and tragedies have proven that to us. Policing involves so many decision points, and officers exercise discretion. Who to pull over, what house to search with a search warrant, what house to search with probable cause, when to feel that a threat is present, when to try and subdue a suspect with a chokehold, when they deem that force is necessary, when to point their gun. These tragedies are justified after the fact by switching on these decision points to justify the outcome. It's true that some officers may feel that they are perfectly justified after pulling the trigger. They may not see that implicit bias and racism in their actions. It's our job to make these truths known. Police officers are often shielded from accountability. The system is rigged with structures that prevent accountability by the police. For example, policies that allow for a cooling off period after an officer shoots someone before an investigation can begin to help the officer prepare their defense. Laws are in place advocated aggressively by police unions to favor the police officer throughout the course of an investigation. District attorneys are reticent to act in bringing cases against an officer with whom they probably work to solve cases. That same favor and consideration isn't given to victims of police violence. They don't get the dignity or safety that the officer enjoys. Once a tragic act is complete, the officer often doesn't face accountability for his or her actions, and his livelihood is intact. He continues to be a police officer with little change in his life. But a life has been lost. It's important to note that being an officer has never been safer. Attacks against police have dropped to all-time lows for decades. This is an issue of racial justice. We have struggled against state violence against people of color for decades. The murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd can be traced back to the racist riots and violence in the prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Greenwood was a profitable Black neighborhood that was ravaged by a racist mob. Their deaths can also be linked to Mayor Wilson Goode giving the order to police to drop a bomb on a Philadelphia city block in 1985. Their deaths, the ultimate tragedy of systemic containment, which was seen in the decades of redlining that made Black neighborhoods less desirable. Racism exists throughout the U.S. society. It's intertwined. The police are actors in these racist structures and often carry out state violence against Black and brown people. There are so many things we need done to make the system of policing more fair and just. A good number of those things can only be done by the city councils and state legislatures that oversee the 18,000 different police departments. There is, however, a role for the federal government to play. Using existing federal funds that police departments count on, we can enact change at the federal level that would apply at the state and local level as well. The Justice in Policing Act is the first ever bold, comprehensive approach to hold police accountable, end racial profiling, change the culture of law enforcement, empower our communities, and build trust between law enforcement and our communities by addressing systemic racism and bias to help save lives. We at FCNL continue to urge Congress to turn the Justice in Policing Act into law. We've been in nearly 100 offices to push for policing reform, but we can't do it alone. As constituents, your voice is key to getting the Justice in Policing Act across the finish line. If officers don't hear from you, this may not move in the 117th Congress. Making this a top priority for Congress next year is our key goal. We need your voices to make this issue a top priority next year. We don't expect that this will pass this year, so thank you for your efforts and advocacy. Now I want to invite my colleague, Cameron Point, who is our program assistant for justice reform issues, to join me for a discussion of some of the kinds of questions we hear when the two of us go into congressional offices. We hope these questions will help you as you prepare for your lobby visit.
Thank you, Jose, for those powerful words. I'm so grateful we're going to discuss an issue so important to us. Friends, please remember that you can find more information, including the main points we're highlighting in the Justice and Policing Act, at fcnl.org/QPPI. I'd like to start our discussion today, Jose, by talking about why national policing reform is necessary. Aren't these local issues? Shouldn't we be leaving policing reform up to state and local governments rather than the federal government?
Thanks for that question, Cameron. We hear that federalism question often when we lobby congressional offices. The reality is that we need a strong, united national response to the ongoing crisis of police brutality. Black and brown people all over the nation are dying at the hands of police every single day. We cannot afford to wait for the over 18,000 police jurisdictions in this country to implement changes. Therefore, police from Maine to California must be held to the same standard of practice and accountability.
Wow, I can only imagine how long it would take for 18,000 separate police jurisdictions to make their own comprehensive reform. And even if they did, I assume all those reforms wouldn't be equitable, as they would differ town to town and state to state. So, Jose, we know that racial profiling was one of the main concerns surrounding our American policing system. How does the Justice in Policing Act address unconscious or conscious racial biases police officers have?
You're right, Cameron. Whether or not officers know it, racial bias can affect what decision officers make regarding people of color. The Justice in Policing Act mandates training on racial, religious, and discriminatory profiling for all local, state, and national law enforcement agencies. It creates a nationwide police misconduct registry to prevent problematic officers who are fired or leave one agency from moving to another jurisdiction without any accountability. The Justice in Policing Act also requires state and local law enforcement agencies to report use of force data by race, sex, disability, religion, and age.
George Floyd was in a chokehold for over 8 minutes after repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." Breonna Taylor was shot in her bed after officers entered her apartment with a no-knock warrant. Jose, does the Justice in Policing Act say anything about chokeholds and no-knock warrants?
So I also wanted to add that Attorney General Cameron in Kentucky brought charges against one of the officers in the Breonna Taylor case for shooting at a neighbor's property, not for killing Breonna Taylor. So I just wanted to make that known because that wasn't videotaped, and that is said to have contributed to those weak charges that didn't even take Breonna Taylor's life into account. And I'll say to your question, Cameron, these practices give police officers the power to decide life and death literal accountability. The Justice and Policing Act bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants like we saw in the Breonna Taylor case at the federal level. Funding for state and local law enforcement is conditioned based on their banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants as well.
That's a good point, Jose. Officers get to choose life or death. And when it comes to Black Americans, we disproportionately see the latter as the outcome. So then, overall, what does the Justice and Policing Act do to limit police violence?
The Justice and Policing Act requires that deadly force be used only as a last resort and mandates officers to employ de-escalation techniques first. The standard for use of force will be changed from reasonable to necessary.
I see. The language of reasonable versus necessary is extremely important when it comes to accountability, especially in use of force incidences. Speaking of accountability, I wonder, what are some more ways that the Justice and Policing Act builds more accountability of police officers?
The Justice and Policing Act requires federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras and requires state and local law enforcement to use existing federal funds to ensure the use of body cameras. Under the Justice and Policing Act, marked federal police vehicles would be required to have dashboard cameras. The statute 18 U.S.C. 242 describes when an officer deprives someone of their rights under color of law or in their official capacity. In the JPA, the threshold for bringing a case under the statute is changed from willfulness to recklessness to permit for more successful cases. This would permit for more recourse in the court against police brutality.
So I've heard that police officers can't be sued in civil court. Is that true, Jose?
You're referring to a legal doctrine called qualified immunity. It shields and permits law enforcement to violate people's constitutional rights with virtual impunity. The Justice and Policing Act makes it easier to prosecute offending officers by amending the legal doctrine to allow for more prosecutions for police misconduct. By reforming qualified immunity for law enforcement, individuals can recover damages in civil court. To put it simply, as it currently stands, in order to avoid frivolous lawsuits, law enforcement are granted qualified immunity from court action. This has been interpreted in an overly broad manner. It's complicated, but here's how it works in order to move a case forward and overcome qualified immunity. There must be another case where the conduct and circumstances are virtually identical, where the officer was found to have acted illegally. If you can't find clearly established precedent, then your case doesn't move forward. No man or woman should be above the law, regardless of whether or not they wear a uniform.
Wow, I didn't know that qualified immunity was basically a legal hall pass for officers to do whatever they want. It's encouraging to see the Justice and Policing Act changing provisions to make officers accountable to the law, just as us everyday citizens are. And now I want to switch our focus to the militarization of police officers. I've noticed more and more police officers with military-grade equipment on American streets. How is that possible, Jose? And would the Justice and Policing Act do anything about it?
You probably noticed that police at protests are suited up as if they are going to war. Programs such as the Department of Defense 1033 program fuel the militarization of law enforcement by arming local and state police like soldiers. The Justice in Policing Act limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement. A sheriff's department in New Hampshire should not be equipped like soldiers.
Yeah, personally, when I see guns and tanks of that caliber on the streets, I don't feel safer. I'm actually more afraid. The imbalance of power over citizens' lives is chilling. So, what role do us everyday people have in the Justice in Policing Act?
For far too long, police officers have been given the most power in overseeing public safety. The Justice in Policing Act establishes grants for community-based organizations to create local commissions and task forces to help communities to reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches.
Thank you. And of course, today we are really wanting to prepare you, our FCNL network, to go into congressional offices and make sure that the Justice in Policing Act is a priority. I just want to remind friends that all this information is available at fcnl.org/QPPI. So Jose, let's just help people specifically get set up so they can plan their visits to congressional offices. For example, if your senator already co-sponsored or voted for the bill, what more do you want the office to do?
I will start off with a big thank you for their support. Let your senator or representative know that we appreciate the momentum and need it going into the next Congress. Encourage them to prioritize supporting the Justice in Policing Act in 2021.
But my sense is people may be feeling like Congress will not pass this bill this year. Realistically, what is Congress going to do this year? And why is it important for us to lobby now, Jose?
Our call for an end to police brutality cannot and will not end with 2020. With our passion and momentum, we are setting up the Justice in Policing Act to be passed in 2021. We need to lobby now in order to show Congress that police reform still remains a top priority. That's why you're here 2 weeks after the election. We need you to stress how important it is that we pass meaningful legislation to bring justice and accountability into communities, especially Black and Brown communities across this country. We've been on the Hill pushing this bill and will continue to be on the Hill to advocate for this bill. The Justice in Policing Act will not pass without this pressure, and that's why we're so thankful for you adding your voice to these efforts.
And since the Justice in Policing Act passed in the House, but not the Senate, one question that friends may have is what we should be saying to Republican lawmakers to get them to pass it this time. For instance, if you're in Iowa lobbying Senator Chuck Grassley, what would you say to him?
Again, it's always great to start with thank you. For example, Senator Chuck Grassley was a champion of the First Step Act, a federal criminal justice reform bill that began to address the harsh prison sentences that have left so many people, particularly so many Black people, incarcerated. Thank the senator for these efforts and let him know that we see addressing police violence as a next step in this effort to address racial injustice in our society. Looking at the 4 components of the Justice in Policing Act, does Senator Grassley support federal legislation to address those 4 key issues? We would love to work with the senator to pass legislation that encompasses these 4 points. Cameron, I know you know how important this is. We must work to fix racist policing policies that allow the targeting and brutalizing of Black and Brown people. We must re-examine the role of police in our nation's framework. Black people cannot and will not feel safe in our nation until our justice system views and treats us as fully human with the complete dignity and respect given to all others.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this important conversation. This legislation is truly a powerful first step to address the violence Black and brown people face at the hands of the police daily. We don't expect you to remember everything we discussed today, but remember, the power of your story as a constituent is what is most important. 600 people will be in congressional offices saying Congress needs to pass legislation to address police reform. Your voices now in these offices saying we want justice and policing to pass quickly are the most vital part of this process. Now we're going to take some questions from friends. Annie, can you tell us if we have any questions from the chat?
Far more questions than we will have time to answer right here, but I do want to remind everyone that if we did not get to your question today, we definitely encourage you to join us at 6:30 Eastern for office hours with Cameron, Jose, and a couple of other folks from our legislative team. So thank you so much for all these wonderful questions. Our first question is from John Dykes. He asks, what are the opposing arguments we may confront?
So the opposing arguments are, we need to make sure that police have everything that they need to do their job to keep us safe. This is a thinking that prioritizes police in safety, which we know isn't the case. Communities keep us safe. It's not a person with a gun that is the key to keeping us safe. We need to remember that the root causes of crime are things like mental illness, poverty, lack of a job, drug addictions. And if we address those issues head on, we can keep our community safer, not just with police. Also, a lot of Republicans will say that we can't pass something as broad as the Justice and Policing Act because we can't be the federal government can't be usurping the states and local government's natural role, which is to oversee police. So those are the main points of pushback that you'll find in offices.
And that's super helpful. Thank you, Jose. Oh, and Cameron, did you want to add something?
I did just want to add to the last point Jose brought up, the federalism argument we tend to hear when we visit offices, especially in the Senate. And just remind those offices that there are 18,000 police jurisdictions in the United States. We need reform in order for it to be equitable. We cannot wait for each individual police jurisdiction to make their own comprehensive reform. And that's why the Justice and Policing Act is so necessary.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Cameron. Elizabeth Kasdan asks, in yesterday's policy debate, meaning during the meeting for business with our general committee, there was a push for defunding/abolishing police rather than reform. Can you discuss FCNL's thinking about how these bills interact with the calls to, quote, defund or abolish?
So thank you for that question. That's a very important movement that's happening actively at the state and local level, promoted by movements that have been instituted and energized by Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project 100. So really from the grassroots. We need to remember that about 95 to 97% of the funding that police receive are from local and state government. And that's why that movement will continue at the state and local level. In terms of federal funds, that makes up about 3 to 5% of what law enforcement receives. And it's more effective to try to encourage change with those funds, to put strings on those funds and say, you must be more just and equitable across the country. And that's why our reform efforts are more so reform efforts than they are defund efforts, because it's much more fruitful to try to seek changes using the existing federal funds that are there.
Great. Cameron, was there anything you wanted to add?
I think that Jose covered it perfectly.
Wonderful. The next question is from Deborah Fink. George Floyd's murder demonstrates that local police aren't necessarily following the law. Is it possible to deny federal funding when local police departments do not enforce the law? And similarly, there was also a question about where oversight of police departments play into this law.
So that's a great question. There's a movement to enforce a particular section of the Civil Rights Act that says agencies that violate the civil rights of U.S. citizens should not receive federal funds. That hasn't been followed, and there's a push to encourage the federal government to follow this section of the Civil Rights Act, and we might see that with the new administration. In terms of accountability, I think a lot of the Justice Policing Act institutes requirements on local and state law enforcement that they act in certain ways to receive federal funds. Certain ways, such as, like we mentioned, with the use of force standard being a necessary standard, and that de-escalation techniques must be used, for instance. So the disbursement of federal funds is conditioned on making changes that are in the Justice Policing Act. That's how we institute more accountability in police, through this legislation.
Wonderful. And I think for just our last question here, we have from John Lodencamper. Does the police demilitarization initiative include some retraining for those coming from the military to refocus from, quote, enemy to, quote, community?
So that's a good question, but I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of what the federal government can do. There's training that happens at the local level, and that would be a good item to consider at the state and local level. I'm not sure that the federal government can take that on.
That makes sense. And Cameron, was there any closing remarks that you wanted to make before I turn it back over to Jose?
No, just thank you for having this discussion with us. We really appreciate your engagement.
Jose, I'd love for you to just leave us with some top line items that you'd like us to all remember as we head into offices.
We don't know what's going to happen next year, but we do know is that if we don't make this a priority through your lobbying, we won't see the Justice and Policing Act move next year. It's important to stress, like Cameron said, there are 18,000 police jurisdictions in the country. We can't possibly wait for each and every one to make changes. People are dying now. The question of federalism is one that we can overcome. We've passed bold legislation that encompasses nationwide policies in the past. And we've done it using federal funds, which is the natural role of Congress, to regulate federal funds and interstate commerce. It's clear that police operate very differently in white communities as opposed to Black communities. And we know that tragedy disproportionately falls on Black communities. Your persistence is so important in making these changes and moving us to real safety and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I think one of the things that really stuck with me is that our advocacy can't wait, and the work that we do now will lay the groundwork for future action. This is what persistent Quaker advocacy looks like. Now that you've had an overview of the ask that you'll be making of your representative offices, we're going to transition to learning about how the lobby visits will work. Many of you have lobbied with FCNL before, some of you dozens of times. But whether this is your first time lobbying or your 50th time lobbying with us, it's important that you stay tuned for the next 30 minutes and also attend the lobby training in your state delegation at 1:40 p.m. Eastern. At its core, virtual lobbying is very similar to in-person lobbying, which you'll hear more about in a moment. But virtual lobbying takes more pre-meeting planning and doesn't adapt as well to last-minute changes. So it is critically important that everyone who plans on going on a lobby visit tomorrow knows the ask, knows their role, and knows what they plan to say and when. Now I'm going to turn it over to Shoshana and Jim Kaysen of FCNL's Strategic Advocacy Team. Shoshana?
So much. Really good to be with you all. So we are here working to prepare you to lobby. So this is what you've all been waiting for, right? We're going to hit the hill tomorrow, and we want you to be prepared. And we know that you have been sitting on Zoom since for about 2 hours now, and many hours over the past couple of days. So we're going to start by doing a fun exercise. So if you have your lobby visit workbook in front of you, hold it up. You can shake it around. If you don't have it, again, you can find it at fcnl.org/QPPI. But we're going to do some stretches. So whether you have it or not, try and do this with me. Raise your lobby packet far over your head. Stretch it to the side, to the other side. You can even shimmy around a little bit. This is our document for the next probably 2 hours as you go into your state prep as well. But really take some time to relax into this because this is what is going to make you prepared for your lobby visits. I'd also want to encourage you to take a selfie with your lobby packet. I know we have some prepared to show you, and you can use the hashtag #ReadyToLobby or FriendsLobby. This is my dog with our lobby packet. If you don't have it printed, again, you can find the resource at fcnl.org/QPPI. As you all know, 2020 has been a year of adjustments. It's us getting used to new technologies, new ways of connecting, and yes, new ways of lobbying. This is our year. This year, lobbying is going to look a little bit different because it'll be on conference calls or video calls rather than in person, but it will still be equally as effective and important. You just heard from Jose and Cameron all about why lobbying is so important right now and what we're asking Congress to do. Some of you have been involved in racial justice work all of your lives, and some of you are new to this work. But regardless, you have all lived in this country over the past 8 months since Breonna Taylor's murder and the past 5 months since George Floyd's murder. And you understand the urgency of this ask. Congress must take action now. So we are advocating for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act tomorrow. There are many members of Congress who will agree with our ask, and that's great. They may have already voted for it, or they may be sponsors of this bill. For them, it will be important to find out what they will do to ensure that this legislation comes up in the first 100 days of the new Congress. We also know that you might run into all kinds of disagreement or dismissal of our act for reasons both practical and substantive. But going into those offices and talking to your members of Congress is critical. You must make sure that they know what you want them to do. The goal is to let them know that you as constituents care deeply about this issue and that you are going to put pressure on them to take action. It's important to remember that you can still build a relationship with the congressional staff, even and I'd say especially when you disagree. So keeping all of that in mind, I want to go through just a couple points of how lobbying actually works over the phone or the computer. So just a couple of things before we walk you through our lobby visit roadmap. If possible, try and join the call early. Use this time to do a roll call. Check sound levels and background noise. If there's a problem with the call-in number or the staffer doesn't appear, we have a FCNL emergency hotline, which is Justin Hurdle, and his cell phone number is 815-608-5515, and you should have that in your email inbox if you're planning on lobbying with us as well. So he's there to help should any technology go awry. Please remember to speak clearly on your lobby visits. Follow that lobby visit roadmap that you'll establish in your state groups. And the group leader will take the time to call on each person as they move throughout the visit. When you speak, remember to state your name each time. Those are things that make the lobby visit really clear. But the last thing I need you to know is don't worry if there are problems. or extra noise, or a cat appears in the background, or you hear a laundry machine. We are all, including congressional staff, learning to live in this new reality. So be kind and recognize that congressional staff are also stressed during this time. Now I'm going to turn things over to Jim Payson to walk us through that all-important lobby visit roadmap. You can turn to page 4 of your lobby visit workbook or find that document at fcnl.org/QPPI. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks everybody for joining us for what is always, for me, the most exciting part of annual meeting in the Quaker Public Policy Institute. I do hope, as Shoshana said, that you'll take out your handy booklet and turn to that lobby roadmap because that really provides us with a guide that'll help make sure you'll have the most successful lobby visit. As Shoshana said, because this is a virtual meeting, one of the most important roles is the group leader. The group leader will need to keep track of time during the meeting, be responsible for ensuring that the roadmap gets filled out in advance, and then calling on people by name during the meeting to prompt people to speak as assigned. And one of the things to keep in mind is that you may not be able to visually see people. Although we're practicing on Zoom, a lot of your meetings are going to take place basically over an audio system. And so there won't be the kind of visual prompts that you would otherwise see. You'll also need a note taker. The note taker takes notes on what the congressional staff says, fills out the report back form, which is so important for Jose and Cameron as they want to do follow-up on your trips, collects the contact information for the delegations, and then follows up with the congressional staffer after the visit. So go ahead and get that virtual lobby workbook out. And if you don't have the workbook, as we've said several times, but I'll say one more time, you can go to fcnl.org and QPPI/QPPI. Now here is the flow of the meeting. First, the group leader will briefly introduce the delegation. How many people? What parts of the state are you from in general? And letting the staff know that you're part of a virtual annual meeting conference with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. The group leader will also ask the congressional staffer how much time they have for the call, so you can calibrate the meeting accordingly. Then you'll identify someone during the practice in just a few minutes who will say thank you. This is critically important because it lets the office know that you're there to have a respectful dialogue and conversation with them. This should be a thank you related to our ask or some other issue. If you're having trouble coming up with something, you can always thank them for taking the time to meet with constituents during this uncertain time. And then someone will introduce the ask. This is where you want to state clearly what it is we're hoping the member of Congress will do, which of course is to support the Justice and Policing Act. If they take anything away from this meeting, we want it to be this. Then it's time for delegation members to share their own personal stories about why they care about addressing police violence. What is motivating you to participate in this conference and then take the trouble to meet with your members of Congress? And how does your personal motivation tie back to your support for the Justice and Policing Act? Remember, your story should only be from your own experience. We are being mindful to talk about our own values and our own stories and not to appropriate those of others. We've actually put, if you have more questions on this after the training, we've put a short video on that same fcnl.org/PPI page that talks about the types of stories if you're stumped on that. Then it's a chance, so several people might ask for it, and then it's a chance for you to ask follow-up questions of the staffer. Ask them things such as, does the member of Congress support this bill? Or does the member have a position on police violence more broadly? If not, why not? What strategies does the member of Congress support to address police violence? Does the member of Congress hear from constituents on this issue? Since you'll be on the phone, again, remember that the group leader should prompt the next person to speak. As Shoshana said, and saying, now over to Jim. And then I said, thank you, Shoshana. And those kind of cues are really important as we move into this virtual arena. Also remember to prompt the staffer to ask questions of the delegation as well. Make sure, in fact, you're leaving time for them to respond and be part of the discussion. You might need to specifically ask for their opinions throughout the phone call. Your goal is to have the staffer answer the question about support for the Justice and Policing Act or its component parts. If you look on page 2 of that same workbook, it includes a one-page document on the bill with some specific points. You can find that document also, of course. I wish you could call and respond at this point at fcnl.org/QPPI. When the conversation is wrapping up, remind them of the ask one more time, and then thank the staffer or the member for taking the time to speak with you. Let them know they'll be following up via email to learn more about their stance on the issue. Make sure you send a follow-up email. We provided in that same booklet a template email for this that includes the delegation members and a copy of the ask. I just close by saying we've had a lot of experience with lobby visits, and many of you have as well. And one key part of this is practice. So when we conclude this session and you get into practicing your own visits, I hope that you'll really take the time to jump into a practice session. I know for myself, for example, it's easy, as many of the FCNL staff know, for me to tell a 10-minute story about why something is important for me. It's a lot harder for me to tell a 90-second story. And then after all of your visit is done, you'll want to make sure to fill out that lobby report back online. That's the way you'll make sure that we can follow up. Now, we're actually going to demonstrate what a phone call might like. So back to you, Shoshana.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you. We all know that your stories are usually more like 10 minutes, but we're going to strive today during this role play to do a 90-second story. So today we are going to do a lobby visit role play. I'm going to pretend to be a congressional staffer who works with Senator Burr's office from North Carolina. My colleagues Bobby, Cameron, and Jim are going to be the constituents who will lobby me. You all ready to go? All right, I'm seeing nods. Okay. And scene.
I can't believe the line cut out. Good thing we dialed into this phone line a few minutes earlier just to check in. Cameron, Jim?
Yes, for sure. I'm glad we made it on the call and are ready to go. You're going to take the lead, right? Just wanted to make sure I remembered what we decided yesterday.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to get started. But Jim, are you there?
I'm excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shoshana from Senator Burr's office.
Hi, Shoshana. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. Super busy day today, but we're trying to finish things up before the end of the year.
Well, we really appreciate you still taking the time to speak with us today with everything going on. My name is Bobby, and I'm joined here by my friends Cameron and Jim. We are here as part of the Friends Committee on National Legislation annual meeting. 600 attendees are lobbying their members of Congress today to address police violence. There are 20 of us on the line today, but only 3 of us will be speaking. Before we get started with the meeting, about how much time do you have to speak with us today, Shoshana?
Thanks so much for checking. I know this is scheduled for 30 minutes, and I hate to do this to you, but something has come up, and I actually only have 10 minutes.
Oh, great. Well, we first wanted to thank Senator Burr for leading a successful effort to permanently renew the Land and Water Conservation Fund under the Great American Outdoors Act. We really appreciate his leadership on this important issue.
I'm glad that you mentioned that and that you're paying attention. That's a really important issue for the senator.
I'm going to turn it over to Cameron to let you know what we'd like to speak with you about today.
Hi, Shoshana. This is Cameron. We're speaking with you today because we'd like Senator Burr to co-sponsor S 3912, the Justice and Policing Act. This issue is so important for us right now as Black and Brown people across the nation experience brutalization at the hands of the police every day. We need to take action immediately.
Thanks, Cameron. Now I'll invite Jim to share his perspective on the issue.
Thanks, Bobby. And I'm Jim Kaysen. I live in Waynesville, North Carolina. I've lived here for 18 years, and I attend the First United Methodist Church, and I'm a real estate agent. I was really deeply moved and upset by the murders of George Floyd that we saw on video and the other murders this year. For me, it was a wake-up call as a white person that I haven't done enough and we haven't done enough as a nation. Here we are, months after, and the country and the world saw those videos. We still don't have national legislation. My faith calls me to act.
Sorry, Jim. Great points, but since Shoshana mentioned she only has a few minutes, let's pass it to Cameron to share.
Oh, sure. Thanks.
Hi, Shoshana. My name is Cameron Point from Bolton, North Carolina. I'm a Black and Indigenous woman of the Lumbee and Waccamaw tribes here in North Carolina. And this issue of police brutality affects me personally because I worry every day that something may happen to me or one of my loved ones, not because we've done anything wrong, but simply because of the color of our skin. Both Black and Native people, my peoples, are victims of police brutality at an alarming rate. So I think about getting a phone call that something might happen to my brother because he was wearing a hoodie, or that I may be shot lying in bed simply because we're Black. So the Justice in Policing Act is a huge and important first step.
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, this is Bobby again. I want to see the Justice in Policing Act passed because as a Quaker and a social worker, I believe in a peaceful world, free from violent militarized police forces. No one should be afraid of the people sworn to protect and serve them. As a college student, I advocated to end the 1033 program and halt police militarization. I saw how bringing assault rifles, tactical gear, and armored vehicles into our neighborhoods made the police seem more like an occupying force than protectors. It undermines trust in the community and leads to undue violence in our towns and our cities, violence that could be mitigated by passing the Justice in Policing Act. I'd love to hear from you, Shoshana, about the senator's position on the bill.
Well, thank you so much all for sharing these stories with me. I'll be sure to pass them along to the senator. He really does care and want to hear what his constituents think about these issues. I'm not that familiar with the specific bill that you mentioned, so I'll have to find it online and read more about it before giving you a full answer. Generally speaking, Senator Burr supports addressing these bad apple police officers and that being dealt with on the local level. So we want to make sure that that is the framing. We don't want to put too many restrictions on states.
Thank you, Shoshana. It's Cameron here. That's great to hear that the Senator Burr acknowledges the problem of police violence. Does the senator have a stance on a national ban on chokeholds?
We support the provisions in the Justice Act that you might be familiar with.
Bobby here again. Good to see the senator considering legislation to address police reform, but the Justice Act doesn't go far enough in addressing our concerns. Local changes are necessary, but with such high rates of police violence, we can't wait for reform to come from all 18,000 law enforcement jurisdictions in the US.
It's Cameron again. I have another question. Is police reform and the militarization of police an issue that the senator hears from his constituents about frequently?
Actually, it isn't a top issue that he hears from people about. So it's good that y'all are here. People are most concerned about healthcare and the economy. I'm actually so sorry. I have to wrap up in just a couple minutes. But thanks for sharing this information with me.
Great. Thank you for your time, Shoshana. We are almost wrapped up, but I believe Jim has one last point to share.
Thanks, Bobby. Our small community in Western North Carolina, our church saw that video of the murder of George Floyd. We're a fairly conservative community, as you know, and I would say most of us feel we have to address this issue of police violence. I would love to be able to share with them what the senator is willing to do.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that.
Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us, Shoshana. Jim will be sending you a follow-up email, and we would love to follow up again with you in about a week.
That sounds great to me. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Shoshana.
Thanks, Shoshana.
And end scene. I'm going to give ourselves a round of applause. Thank you so much to our lobbying team here. That was really great. And I think you all had a very successful lobby visit with Senator Burr's office, despite the lack of agreement on the ask. So Cameron, what did you think that you all did really well?
I think we did really well passing it off to each other. I knew when it was my time to speak because we planned in advance in the lobby training and wrote down when everybody was going to speak and our role assignments were. So that was very clear to me when it was my turn to speak.
Absolutely. I believe that you all very much stuck to the script that you worked on. You knew who was doing what and you were well prepared. I think it was especially great to see how Bobby and Cameron identified themselves before they spoke and made sure to ask me plenty of questions and gave me time to respond as a staffer. Cameron, I thought you all had a really great thank you worked in. Can you tell me why this is so important?
Absolutely. I think having a genuine and specific thank you helped ground this meeting in the FCNL style of relationship building, even when the member of Congress gave pushback.
Absolutely. Bobby, what do you think about how the storytelling worked during this lobby visit?
I thought it went really well. I really liked how we all spoke from our own experiences and shared a variety of perspectives on why passing the Justice in Policing Act matters to so many different people. I did notice that we had pretty limited time, so I had to jump in and interrupt Jim to shorten his story a bit.
Yeah, that definitely happens during lobby visits. That's why it was so important for you to ask that question. You were an excellent group leader because you paid attention to the time and facilitated the whole way through that meeting. Your interruption of Jim, while sometimes can feel harsh, was smooth and kept a positive tone to the meeting. Jim, how do you all think you did on the ask? Was it a clear ask?
Yes, I thought we did a great job on the ask of getting Senator Burr to co-sponsor the Justice in Policing Act. But I wonder if we should have, I think, in fact, we should have repeated it a few more times. I think we want to try to state the ask at least 3 times in these meetings. And I would also say that we could have done a better job emphasizing and describing where we're from. As the note taker, I should have explained to the staffer that the group will provide a list of the delegation members and a leave behind in the follow-up email.
Yeah, those are all really great points. I especially like that Bobby said at the beginning that there are 20 folks on the line today, but only 3 of us will be speaking. Some of our lobby visits for tomorrow have upwards of 80 people scheduled to be on, and that's a powerful statement, even if you won't all be able to speak. Jim, what did you mean by emphasizing and describing where you're coming from?
Well, I think for the people speaking, it is really important to say the city or town where you're from, and even mention an organization you're affiliated with, such as I said, I was with a particular Methodist church and I was a former real estate agent. That makes the people feel more real. And if you have a big delegation, you're not going to be able to introduce everyone, but it's useful for someone from Pennsylvania, for instance, to understand that we've got people from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, but also from Harrisonburg, and from different parts of the state. That really gives the office a sense that this is a statewide community of people, not just a particular group from one part of the country.
Absolutely. Yes, it's so important to ground yourself in the community. So thank you again so much for being our lobby visit role play. I hope that role play illustrated for all of you constituents on the line how an effective lobby visit can go. Great work, team. So one more time, we're going to go over this lobby visit roadmap. And as you are all screaming out loud, you can find the fcnl.org/QPPI is where you can find the lobby visit roadmap if you don't have it yet. So again, one more time, the first thing you will do is an introduction. The second thing you will do is ask how much time you have in the visit. The third thing you will do is say a genuine thank you to set the tone for the meeting. You'll introduce the ask clearly, then you'll tell your stories, and then you'll engage in conversation by asking a staff member questions and waiting to hear their response. You'll end by repeating the ask and thanking the legislator or staff member. And the 2 most important things that you do directly after the meeting are follow up with follow up with an email to the staffer that you met with, and that will be the job of the note taker. And fill out the lobby report back form. I have to emphasize this just one more time, that if you don't report back to FCNL what happened on your visit, it's like it didn't happen at all to FCNL. So if you want Jose and Cameron to be able to follow up on your really powerful lobby visits, your 600 constituent, I think 43 state lobby visits, we need to have that lobby visit, that lobby report back form. So please take the time to do that. And the link for that is fcnl.org/reportback. So I am going to hand things back over to Annie so we can get settled for our next portion.
Thank you so much, Shoshana. Up next, we have lobby trainings in our state delegations. In these trainings, you're going to go through your visits, assign roles, and even do a lobby role play like you just saw. It's a super helpful step in making sure that everyone in your state delegation is prepared and everyone's on the same page. Remember that your attendance is actually required at this next session if you plan on lobbying tomorrow. So we hope that you will join us in just a little bit if you are planning on lobbying tomorrow. To find the Zoom meeting link, so we'll be back in Zoom for this next session, you for your state training, you go back to fcnl.org/am schedule. So many of you know that link very well at this point. Again, that's fcnl.org/am schedule, and you'll click on your state, and you'll either join by computer, or there's also call-in information listed at the top of the page. After you plan your lobby visits, there's an opportunity for worship sharing. Worship sharing is a Quaker practice of reflecting together in small groups on questions and readings. It is open to everyone. Find the link for your small group at fcnl.org/am schedule. You can also see the schedule for what else is happening this afternoon. There'll be opportunities to be together in caucus groups. We'll have the opportunity to learn more about FCNL's work on different issues during our Wonk Talk sessions. And we'll, of course, be able to answer any lingering questions you might have about the Justice and Policing Act during our office hours this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're all excited to join in groups with your state delegations. And we look forward to seeing you in a few more minutes at your lobby trainings at 1:40 p.m. Eastern. And do stick around for the applause videos about to play. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.